The hit series Khan's Shadow showed you a heroic last stand at the Kalka River. But what if I told you the real battle was a 9-day trap, ending in one of the most brutal executions in history? The truth is far more shocking than the fiction. It's one of the most breathtaking sequences in modern television. The premiere of Khan's Shadow gives us a scene of epic proportions. The princes of the Kievan Rus, a shining coalition of Christendom's eastern flank, standing defiant against the strange new horsemen from the east. We see Mstislav the Daring, his armor gleaming, his jaw set, rallying his troops with speeches of valor and glory. The show paints the Battle of Kalka River as a tragic yet noble clash of empires. A heroic last stand against an overwhelming tide. It's glorious, it's inspiring, and it is almost entirely a lie. What the showrunners of Khan's Shadow gave you was a beautifully crafted myth. What they didn't give you was the truth. The truth is that the Battle of Kalka River was not a noble defense. It was the calamitous end to a poorly conceived manhunt. It wasn't a straightforward battle. It was an elaborate 9-day psychological trap executed with terrifying precision. And the final stand of the Rus princes wasn't a blaze of glory. It ended with a surrender, a promise, and one of the most gruesome and humiliating mass executions in medieval history. For years, we have been captivated by the drama, but today we peel back the fiction. My name is your name, and this is History Uncovered. In this series, we take the historical epics you love and hold them up to the unflinching light of the historical record. In our premiere episode, we are tackling the foundational event of Khan's Shadow, the first bloody encounter between the Rus and the Mongols. We will analyze what really happened at the Battle of Kalka River, exploring the monumental arrogance of the Rus leadership, the genius of the two Mongol generals the show barely mentions, and the devastating consequences of underestimating an enemy. We will delve into the primary sources, from the Novgorod Chronicle to the secret history of the Mongols, to reconstruct the events of that fateful spring in 1223. We will explore the intricacies of the Mongol feigned retreat tactic, a maneuver so effective it would be the cornerstone of their conquests for a century. This isn't just about pointing out inaccuracies. This is about understanding why the truth was so much more strategically brilliant and so much more terrifying than the fiction you saw on screen. So, prepare yourselves. We're about to uncover the lies they told you about the Battle of Kalka River. To understand the catastrophe at the Kalka River, we must first erase the image Khan's Shadow plants in our minds. The show presents the Mongol arrival as the spearhead of a grand invasion, a deliberate push into the heart of the Rus lands. This framing serves a simple narrative, an evil empire invading a peaceful kingdom. But the historical reality is far more complex and strategically fascinating. The 20,000 Mongols who appeared on the steppes north of the Black Sea in 1223 were not an invasion force. They were the exhausted, battle-hardened survivors of one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history, Jebe and Subutai's Great Raid. This wasn't a prelude to the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus. It was the epilogue to the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire. Let's rewind 2 years. Genghis Khan had unleashed his fury upon the massive Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, shattering its armies and sacking its legendary cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. As the empire crumbled, its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, fled west. Genghis Khan dispatched his two most brilliant and trusted generals, Jebe, known as the Arrow, and Subutai, the future architect of conquests from China to Hungary, with a specific mission. They were given 20,000 men and a single objective: hunt down and capture Shah Muhammad. What followed was a relentless 3-year pursuit covering thousands of miles. They chased the Shah through Persia, into the Caucasus Mountains, and to the shores of the Caspian Sea, where he finally died of illness on a remote island. Mission accomplished. For most armies, this would be the end of the campaign. They would turn around and march the thousands of miles back to rejoin the main Mongol host. But Jebe and Subutai were not most commanders. They saw an opportunity. With the Khan's permission, they were to conduct a reconnaissance in force, a deep, probing raid to gather intelligence on the lands that lay beyond the known world. This is a critical distinction. An invasion force is heavy, laden with siege equipment and a logistical tail. A reconnaissance force is light, fast, and lethal, designed to fight, learn, and move on. They swept through the Caucasus, systematically defeating the powerful Georgian knights in a series of brilliant tactical victories. They then emerged onto the vast Pontic-Caspian steppe, the homeland of the Cumans, a powerful confederation of Turkic nomadic tribes. The Cumans, also known as the Pelovsians, were a formidable military power in their own right, and they controlled the lucrative trade routes of the region. They were also the faction that Khan's shadow portrays as little more than untrustworthy mercenaries. In reality, they had deep, complex relationships with the Rus princes, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, and often as family through political marriages. When the Mongols arrived, they first crushed a Cuman army. The Cuman Khan, Khotin, a shrewd leader, understood he was facing a new kind of threat. He fled north to the courts of his Rus allies and, more importantly, his son-in-law, Mstislav Mstislavich of Galicia, known as Mstislav the Daring. The plea he made, as recorded in the chronicles, was chilling. "Today they have taken our land. Tomorrow they will take yours." This is the spark that ignites the conflict. It wasn't a Mongol invasion. It was the Rus princes deciding to intervene in a conflict that, until that moment, had nothing to do with them. They weren't defending their homeland. They were launching a preemptive strike, marching far beyond their own borders to aid an ally and destroy a mysterious new enemy. This decision, born of a mixture of duty, greed for glory, and a catastrophic underestimation of their foe, would lead them directly into the jaws of a trap set by the most experienced and dangerous warriors on the planet. A battle is a contest of wills between commanders, and the Battle of Kalka River represents one of the greatest mismatches in military history. Khan's shadow simplifies this into a classic good versus evil narrative. It gives us Mstislav the Daring as the flawed hero and a generic, snarling Mongol warlord as the villain. The reality is a far more compelling story of celebrated mediocrity versus anonymous genius. Let's first examine the Rus command structure, or rather, the lack thereof. The Kievan Rus of the 13th century was not a unified state. It was a loose confederation of squabbling principalities, each ruled by a prince fiercely protective of his own authority. When the call to arms came, a powerful coalition assembled, numbering perhaps as many as 80,000 men when combined with their Cuman allies. It was a massive host, comprising the forces of Kiev, Galicia, Chernigov, Volhynia, and several other smaller principalities. The problem was, this army had no single supreme commander. It was led by a council of 3 senior princes, each named Mstislav. There was Mstislav Romanovich of Kiev, the nominal leader due to the prestige of his city. There was Mstislav Sviatoslavich of Chernigov, and then there was the man who initiated the entire campaign, Mstislav Mstislavich of Galicia, or Mstislav the Daring. The Daring was an apt title. He was the most celebrated warrior in all the Rus lands, a man renowned for his personal bravery, charisma, and a string of victories against Hungarians, Poles, and the Cumans themselves. He was the archetypal medieval knight prince, impetuous, obsessed with personal glory. He was the one who, upon hearing Khotin's plea, famously declared, "It is better for us to fall here than to let our fatherland be taken." He saw this as the ultimate adventure, a chance to win immortal fame by crushing this unknown Eastern horde. His confidence, bordering on arrogance, was infectious, and it drowned out the voices of caution. The chronicles tell us he and the other younger princes belittled the Mongols, treating them as little more than a band of steppe vagrants. They had absolutely no concept of who they were about to fight. On the other side were Jebe and Subutai. In Khan's shadow, they are either absent or morphed into a single brutish antagonist. In history, they are titans. Jebe, once an enemy of Genghis Khan, was so skilled an archer and commander that the Khan spared him and brought him into his inner circle. His defining characteristic was speed, relentless, lightning-fast movement that paralyzed his enemies. Subutai was something else entirely. He was not a charismatic prince or a dashing warrior. He was a strategist of unparalleled genius, the ultimate military professional. He was the Khan's hound of war. He believed in meticulous planning, intelligence gathering, and the complete psychological destruction of the enemy before the first arrow was even loosed. While the Rus princes bickered over precedents and dreamed of heroic charges, Subutai was studying his enemy. When the Mongols first made contact, they sent ambassadors to the Rus camp. Their message was clear: "We have no quarrel with you. We have come against our slaves, the Cumans. Take our tribute and make peace with us." This was classic Mongol diplomacy, an attempt to divide their enemies. Mstislav the Daring, in a fit of hubris that sealed his army's fate, had the ambassadors executed. For the Mongols, the killing of an envoy was the ultimate casus belli, an unforgivable sin that demanded total annihilation in response. A second set of envoys arrived, this time with a formal declaration of war. "You have chosen war. You have killed our ambassadors. So be it. We did not touch you, but now let God be the judge between us." Even then, the Rus princes were blind to their peril. They saw the Mongol force, a mere 20,000, and scoffed. Their own army was 4 times that size. They had heavy cavalry, armored infantry, and the fierce Cuman horsemen. What could go wrong? They failed to understand that they were not facing a conventional army. They were facing an idea, the Mongol way of war, perfected over decades of brutal conquest. It was a system that turned individual bravery into a liability and rewarded discipline, coordination, and deception above all else. The stage was set. On one side, an army led by arrogant, glory-seeking princes with no unified command. On the other, a smaller, cohesive force led by 2 of the greatest military minds in history. The outcome was all but inevitable. The central military action of the Battle of Kalka River, the key to the entire Mongol victory, is a tactic that Khan's shadow completely ignores, likely because it is devoid of the straightforward, heroic clashes that look good on screen. This tactic was the feigned retreat. It was not simply a trick. It was the core of Mongol operational art, a complex and highly disciplined maneuver designed to manipulate an enemy into catastrophic mistakes. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale. After the Rus crossed the Dnieper River to engage them, the Mongols did not form a battle line. They did not stand and fight. Instead, their advance guard engaged Mstislav the Daring's vanguard, skirmished briefly, and then broke and fled. To the overconfident Rus princes, this was proof of what they already believed. The Mongols were weak, cowardly, and terrified of their magnificent army. Mstislav the Daring, living up to his name, immediately ordered a pursuit. He didn't consult the other princes. He charged ahead with his own retinue and his Cuman allies, eager to win all the glory for himself. The other Rus forces, seeing his banner surge forward, had no choice but to follow, their own columns becoming stretched out and disorganized as they tried to keep pace. This is exactly what Jebe and Subutai wanted. The feigned retreat was not a panicked rout. It was a carefully managed, staged withdrawal. A small contingent of heavily armored Mongol rearguard cavalry would periodically turn and fight, holding the pursuers just long enough to inflict some casualties and keep them engaged, before melting away again. This had several devastating effects on the Rus army. First, it completely destroyed their cohesion. The fastest and most eager warriors, like Mstislav the Daring and the Cumans, raced far ahead. The slower, heavier infantry and the forces of the other princes, like Mstislav of Kiev, fell further and further behind. What was once a unified army became a series of fragmented, uncoordinated columns spread out over many miles. Second, it lured them deep into unfamiliar territory. The Mongols drew them eastward, away from their supply lines, across the vast, featureless steppe. For 9 full days, this relentless pursuit continued. 9 days. Imagine the physical and psychological toll. The Rus and Cuman horses were exhausted. The soldiers were weary, their initial enthusiasm turning into a grim, frustrating slog. They were constantly chasing a phantom, an enemy that refused to give them the pitched battle they craved. Meanwhile, the Mongol horses, bred for the endurance of the steppe, were far less fatigued. The Mongol warriors were masters of living off the land, and this was their element. Subutai was controlling the pace and direction of the entire campaign, leading the Rus princes by a leash to a killing ground of his own choosing. The chronicles describe how the Rus captured some Mongol stragglers who told them the Mongols were fleeing in terror back to Asia. This was likely deliberate disinformation, planted to further fuel Rus' arrogance and ensure they kept up the chase. All the while, the main Mongol force was riding ahead, resting their horses and preparing. On the 9th day of the pursuit, Mstislav the Daring's vanguard reached a small, inconspicuous river, the Kalka. On the far side, they finally saw what they had been chasing. The main Mongol army was drawn up in battle formation, waiting for them. Exhausted, overconfident, and completely isolated from the rest of their army, Mstislav the Daring did not pause. He did not wait for reinforcements. He did not scout the enemy's position. He ordered an immediate, full-scale charge across the river. He had chased the enemy for over 100 miles, and he was not about to let them escape now. He was charging headlong into the most perfectly laid trap of his career. The feigned retreat was complete. The jaws of the trap were about to spring shut. The scene that Khan's shadow presents as the main battle, a single, massive clash on an open field, is a dramatic fiction. The actual Battle of Kalka River was a running, multi-stage slaughter that took place over a vast area, a testament to the chaos sown by the Mongols' brilliant strategy. When Mstislav the Daring and his Galician troops, along with their Cuman allies, splashed across the Kalka River, they were met with a terrifying sight. The Mongol center, composed of light horse archers, unleashed a storm of arrows, darkening the sky. This was not the disorganized rabble they had been chasing. This was a disciplined, coordinated fighting force. But still, the Rus and Cumans had superior numbers at the point of contact, and their heavy cavalry charge initially drove the Mongol center back. For a fleeting moment, Mstislav the Daring must have felt the thrill of impending victory. This was the moment the trap sprung. As the Mongol center gave way, it was a planned movement. It drew the charging knights further in, disordering their ranks and tiring their horses. Then, from both flanks, hidden Mongol wings crashed into the sides of the now overextended Rus and Cuman line. These were not light skirmishers. This was the Mongol heavy cavalry, lancers in full lamellar armor, wielding lances, maces, and sabers. They hit the Cuman flank first. The Cumans, being steppe nomads themselves, understood immediately what was happening. They were being enveloped. Unlike the Rus, they had no tradition of fighting to the death for honor. Their way of war was fluid. They broke. The entire Cuman contingent, tens of thousands strong, turned and fled in a single panicked wave. This was the second stage of the disaster. The fleeing Cumans did not simply leave the battlefield. They crashed directly back into the ranks of the advancing Rus forces who were still crossing the river and marching to join the battle. The army of Prince Oleg of Kursk was trampled under the hooves of their own allies. The advancing columns of Mstislav of Chernigov were thrown into complete disarray as thousands of panicked horsemen smashed through their lines, sowing chaos and fear. The disciplined front of the Rus army ceased to exist. It became a confused, terrified mob. Now the Mongols advanced. The feigned retreat was over. The feigned flight of the center was over. This was the hammer blow. Mongol horse archers, masters of the Parthian shot, rode alongside the disintegrating Rus columns, pouring arrows into their flanks. The Mongol heavy cavalry methodically rolled up the fragmented pockets of resistance. Mstislav the Daring, seeing the battle was utterly lost, managed to cut his way out with a small remnant of his own retinue and fled for his life. He was one of the first to run, leaving the rest of the army to its fate. Mstislav of Chernigov was killed in the fighting, along with his son. Prince after prince, noble after noble, was cut down in the brutal, one-sided melee. The Mongols offered no quarter. Their orders were to annihilate the enemy. The pursuit was as ruthless as the battle itself. For days afterward, Mongol cavalry scoured the steppe, hunting down and killing any survivors they could find. The chronicles paint a grim picture of a land littered with the bodies of the flower of Rus nobility. The army that had so confidently marched out to meet the Mongols just weeks before had, in the space of a few hours, effectively ceased to exist. But what about Mstislav of Kiev, the most senior prince with the largest and freshest contingent of troops? He had been so far behind the main chase that he and his army of 10,000 had not even participated in the battle. He witnessed the catastrophic rout from a distance. As panicked survivors streamed past his position, he made a decision. He would not run. He used the terrain to his advantage, fortifying a camp on a rocky hill overlooking the Dnieper River. It was a strong defensive position. Here, he believed, he could make a stand. The main battle was over, but the final and perhaps most brutal act of the tragedy was about to begin. In Khan's shadow, the climax of the battle is a glorious, if doomed, last stand. We see the Rus princes, surrounded and outnumbered, fighting back to back, selling their lives dearly in a maelstrom of steel and heroism. This narrative provides a sense of honor in defeat, a moral victory even in the face of annihilation. The historical reality of the final act at the Kalka River is devoid of such romance. It is a grim tale of a siege, dwindling hope, and ultimate betrayal. Mstislav of Kiev, along with two other princes, had successfully fortified their camp on a hill. It was a well-chosen spot, and for 3 days they held off the Mongol assaults. The Mongols, primarily cavalry, were not equipped for a prolonged siege of a fortified position. They took casualties in their attempts to storm the hill, but their grip was tightening. They controlled the surrounding area, and most importantly, they cut off the defenders from their water source, the river. Inside the camp, the situation grew desperate. The Rus soldiers were exhausted, demoralized by the news of the main army's destruction, and now suffering from a crippling thirst. Mstislav of Kiev knew that a breakout was impossible. He was surrounded by an enemy that had just obliterated a force 4 times his size. His only hope was a negotiated surrender. At this point, a man named Plaskina appears in the historical record. He was the leader of the Brodnichi, a group of Slavic freebooters or mercenaries who were allied with the Mongols. Because he was a Christian, he was sent as an envoy to the besieged Rus camp. Plaskina approached Mstislav of Kiev and the other princes with an offer from the Mongol commanders. The offer was simple: surrender and your lives will be spared. A ransom will be taken for the princes, as was common in European warfare, and the common soldiers will be allowed to return home. Crucially, Plaskina swore a holy oath upon the cross that no blood would be shed. For the desperate princes, trapped and without hope, it seemed like the only way out. They trusted the oath of a fellow Christian. They agreed to the terms. They laid down their arms, opened the gates of their camp, and surrendered to the Mongols. The common soldiers were immediately set upon by the Mongol warriors. Some were killed, others enslaved. The promise to them was broken instantly. But the Mongols reserved a special fate for the princes. Mstislav of Kiev and the other captured nobles were bound. The Mongols, adhering to the letter of their promise, were not going to shed their royal blood. The great Genghis Khan had a belief that the spirit of a warrior resided in his blood, and that it was a dishonor to spill the blood of noble adversaries upon the ground. So they devised a solution that was both ritually correct and maximally cruel. This is where the story turns from a military disaster into a true nightmare, and it's a scene that Khan's shadow, for all its grit, did not dare to portray accurately. The final stand was not a battle. It was a 3-day siege that ended not with a clash of swords, but with a calculated, treacherous promise. The princes were not killed in the heat of combat, defiant to the last. They were captured alive, their hope for mercy predicated on a sacred oath that their enemies had no intention of honoring. What happened next is one of the most infamous events in the history of the Mongol conquests. It is an act of calculated cruelty so profound that it has echoed through the centuries, a chilling demonstration of the Mongol attitude toward vanquished leaders who had defied them. Having captured the Rus princes through the treacherous oath of Plaskina, the Mongols prepared for their victory celebration. They saw the princes not as honorable foes to be ransomed, but as oath-breakers who had murdered their ambassadors. In their worldview, such a crime demanded an exemplary punishment. The bound princes, including Mstislav of Kiev, were taken and laid flat upon the ground. The Mongols then constructed a large, heavy wooden platform directly on top of them. They were placed beneath the floorboards, pinned but still alive. Upon this platform, Jebe, Subutai, and the other Mongol leaders held their victory feast. They sat, they ate, they drank, and they celebrated their stunning success. And as they did, the Rus princes beneath them were slowly and agonizingly crushed to death under the weight of the platform and the movement of the feasting commanders. No blood was shed. The oath was, in their brutal interpretation, technically kept. The death was slow, torturous, and utterly humiliating. It was a death designed to make a statement. This is the fate of kings who oppose the will of the great Khan. It was psychological warfare of the highest order, intended to terrorize any other rulers who might hear of it. This horrific event is the true end of the Battle of the Kalka River. It wasn't a final, desperate sword swing. It was the sound of bones breaking under the weight of a conqueror's feast. Compare this to the version in Khan's Shadow. The show likely depicted a death in battle for the main princes, a quick and merciful end that preserved their dignity. This is a common trope in historical fiction. It sanitizes the past, making it more palatable for a modern audience. It allows the heroes to die as heroes. But in doing so, it completely misses the point of the historical event. The Mongols were not interested in their enemy's dignity. They were interested in subjugation, in breaking the will to resist. The execution of the princes was not an act of random cruelty. It was state policy. It was a calculated message of terror that would pave the way for future conquests. By changing this ending, Khan's Shadow fundamentally alters the nature of the Mongols as historical actors. It reduces them to conventional barbarians, when in fact they were something far more sophisticated and terrifying. Strategic geniuses who wielded terror as a precision instrument. The truth of the Kalka River is that the Rus princes were not only outfought and outthought, they were ritually and systematically humiliated in a way that would leave a deep psychological scar on the Rus people for generations. This was not just a defeat, it was an annihilation of an entire generation of leadership carried out with a level of cold, calculated brutality that the sanitized world of television can scarcely comprehend. With the Rus armies shattered and their leadership executed, the entire land of Kievan Rus lay open and defenseless before Jebe and Subutai. They had a clear path to Kiev, the mother of all Rus cities. They could have marched on, sacking and plundering as they went. But they didn't. This is another crucial point that is often misunderstood. The purpose of this campaign was not conquest. It was reconnaissance. Having gathered all the intelligence they needed about the lands, the armies, the political divisions, and the fighting spirit of the Rus, the Mongols simply turned around and headed east to rendezvous with the main Mongol army. Their great raid, which had taken them on a massive circular route around the Caspian Sea, was finally over. The aftermath in Kievan Rus was one of shock and profound grief. The chronicles state that, for our sins, unknown nations arrived, and there was weeping and wailing throughout our towns and villages. An entire generation of the ruling class had been wiped out in a single campaign. But incredibly, the Rus seemed to have learned almost nothing from the disaster. Because the Mongols had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, a strange sense of denial seems to have taken hold. The defeat at Kalka was viewed not as a terrifying preview of a new form of warfare, but as a freak occurrence, a strange and terrible raid by a phantom enemy who was now gone forever. They did not unify. They did not reform their armies. They did not study the tactics that had so comprehensively destroyed them. The surviving princes went right back to their petty squabbles and internecine warfare, fighting over the scraps of power. They failed to understand that what they had experienced was not the invasion itself, but merely the scouting report. Subutai, however, did not forget. The intelligence he gathered at Kalka on the terrain, the river crossings, the political disunity of the princes, and their predictable, honor-bound tactics was meticulously filed away. It would become the foundation for the real invasion. 14 years later, in the winter of 1237, Subutai would return. But this time, he would not have 20,000 men. He would come at the head of a massive Mongol host of over 100,000 warriors, under the command of Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. This was the true Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus. And this time, there would be no feigned retreats or elaborate traps. It would be a brutal, systematic campaign of annihilation. One by one, the cities of the Rus fell. Ryazan, Vladimir, and finally, in 1240, the great city of Kiev itself was besieged and utterly destroyed. The state of Kievan Rus was extinguished, and the region would live under the domination of the Mongol successor state, the Golden Horde, for the next 240 years. The Battle of Kalka River was the dress rehearsal. The full-scale invasion was the performance, and it was a tragedy written in blood, fire, and conquest. The warning had been delivered in 1223, written in the destruction of their armies and the crushed bones of their princes. But it was a warning that went completely, tragically unheeded. So, we return to our initial question. Did Khan's shadow get the Battle of Kalka River right? The answer is a resounding no. While the show may have captured a sliver of the spirit of the era, its portrayal of this pivotal historical event is a work of fiction, fundamentally misrepresenting the context, the key players, the tactics, and the gruesome conclusion. Let's recap the major divergences. First, the context. The show presents a premeditated Mongol invasion, a narrative of pure aggression. The reality was the final chapter of Jebe and Subutai's great raid, a reconnaissance in force that the Rus chose to intercept. The Rus were the initial aggressors in this specific conflict. Second, the commanders. Khan's shadow gives us a heroic but flawed Mstislav the Daring as the central protagonist. While his bravery is historical, the show downplays the fatal arrogance and lack of coordination among the Rus princes, which was a primary cause of their defeat. More egregiously, it erases or minimizes the historical genius of Jebe and Subutai, arguably two of the top 10 commanders in all of military history, reducing them to generic antagonists. Third, the tactics. The show depicts a conventional pitched battle. This completely misses the 9-day feigned retreat, the brilliant psychological operation that was the true core of the Mongol victory. It replaces strategic genius with a simple clash of numbers, dumbing down the very essence of Mongol warfare.
Fourth, the ending. The show gives its heroes a noble, dignified death in battle. This sanitizes the horrific truth of the siege of Mstislav of Kiev's camp, the treacherous promise of safety, and the ritualistic execution of the princes at the feast of death. By making these changes, the creators of Khan's Shadow made a series of deliberate narrative choices. They chose simplicity over complexity, heroic tropes over historical reality, and palatable drama over uncomfortable truths. And in many ways, that's understandable. A 9-day chase is hard to film. A command structure of 3 different guys named Mstislav is confusing for the audience. An ending where the heroes are tricked and then slowly crushed to death is profoundly unsatisfying from a traditional storytelling perspective. But does it matter? I believe it does. It matters because by altering these details, the show misses an opportunity to teach a deeper, more resonant lesson about history. The real story of the Battle of Kalka River isn't just about bravery. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance, the importance of unity, and the folly of underestimating an opponent. It's a story that shows how discipline and strategy can overcome brute force, how psychological warfare can be more devastating than any sword. The real Mongols are far more compelling and terrifying than their fictional counterparts precisely because they were not just savage barbarians. They were sophisticated, disciplined, and strategically brilliant. Subutai was not a monster. He was a master of his craft, and his craft was war. To understand him is to understand the forces that shape the modern world. Historical fiction has a powerful role to play in bringing the past to life. But when we consume it, we must remain critical. We must ask ourselves what has been changed and why. The true story is often messier, more complex, and more brutal than the fiction, but it is also invariably more fascinating. The Battle of Kalka River was not the heroic clash Khan Shadow wanted it to be. It was a masterclass in military deception meeting head-on with catastrophic hubris, and that is a far better story. In the end, Khan Shadow uses the Battle of Kalka River as a dramatic opening act, a backdrop for its characters. But the history of the event itself is a powerful epic in its own right. It's a story of the collision of 2 worlds, the fractured, chivalrous society of the Kievan Rus and the unified, ruthlessly pragmatic war machine of the Mongol Empire. We've seen how the Rus princes, blinded by arrogance and disunity, charged head-first into a meticulously planned trap. We've dissected the genius of the Mongol feigned retreat and witnessed the horrific, calculated cruelty of the aftermath.
The lesson of Kalka is timeless. Ignoring a new threat, failing to understand its methods, and allowing internal division to dictate strategy is a recipe for disaster. The Rus paid the ultimate price for these failures, a price that would cost them their freedom for nearly 2.5 centuries. The shadows of the Khans were long indeed, and their story is a stark reminder that history is written not by the most heroic, but by the most adaptable and the most ruthless. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the historical accuracy of Khan Shadow and the real story of the Battle of Kalka River. I hope this analysis has given you a new perspective on this incredible moment in history. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of the show's portrayal? Which historical inaccuracy we discussed today shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you believe, as I do, that history is the greatest story ever told, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to History Uncovered. Click that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll be tackling another legendary historical epic. Your support allows me to continue making these deep dives. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never stop digging for the truth.